Hi, I'm Sandeep, and you're watching the Indian Weekender. It has been 3 months since New Zealand borders were first closed on March 19th for everyone except citizens and residents, leaving almost 62,000 temporary visa holders outside the country. It has been exactly 2 months since we have come out of Alert Level 4 lockdown on April 27. It has been almost 20 days since we have slowly cruised into Alert Level 1, bringing some sort of normalcy in our lives. It has been exactly 45 days since the new Immigration COVID 19 Response Amendment Act has become a law, after the legislation was rushed through the Parliament in a record time of few days. To grant unprecedented powers to Immigration New Zealand, under the pretext that the department needed those powers to act favorably and expeditiously in favor of temporary visa holders. Yet, 45 days after that enactment of the law, we haven't seen that law being applied for one single instance to help the cause of temporary migrants, especially those who are stuck overseas. And they continue to live their life in uncertainty about their future in this country. Unfortunately, for those who have been lucky to be onshore, when the borders were closed, things are not remarkably different as well. And they continue to anxiously watch how Immigration New Zealand is repositioning itself for assessment of all existing essential skilled work visas quietly, making it tough for employers to hire migrant workers in near future. It is even worse for thousands of such temporary migrant workers who are on shore and who are in a seemingly never ending visa processing queue for skilled migrant category, waiting for instances maybe around 2 years. And there seems to be no light at the end of the tunnel. It is clear that temporary migrant workers are being forced by this government to bear the maximum burden of what should have been our collective fight against the COVID 19 public health pandemic. So, would this government eventually offer some kindness and compassion that it talks about to these temporary migrant workers? So, let's go and ask none other than Immigration Minister Iain Lees-Galloway himself. Thank you for joining our virtual studio, Minister. How are you today?
I'm well, thanks, Sandeep. It's always a pleasure to see you.
Great. So, Minister, our first question is, I'm pretty sure you would be anticipating this question as well. Tens of thousands of our temporary migrant workers who are stuck overseas, they are waiting to hear first decision coming from your government when they can enter back into the country. So, what do you have to say about them?
Look, first of all, I have to say I can understand people's frustration. You know, people all around the world have had their lives disrupted by COVID-19. And we've got to remind ourselves that whilst we're doing extremely well here in New Zealand, with no cases of community transmission for months now, around the rest of the world, yeah, we're seeing 100,000 new cases of COVID-19 every day, people continuing to die with the virus, and people's lives being disrupted all around the world. And as you rightly point out, some of those people who have had their lives significantly disrupted are those temporary visa holders who are currently outside of New Zealand. And I should imagine, this will be happening in countries all around the world as well. So you say, as you say, there's around 60,000 people who hold temporary visas, but of those, we think there's probably around 10,000 people who have made a life here in New Zealand or started to make a life here in New Zealand, who are likely looking to come back to New Zealand at some point in time. And they are on our minds. They're absolutely top of mind for me. We are working through what a policy could look like to enable the sequencing of people's return to New Zealand. I think we're all very well aware of the fact that we need everyone to go into managed isolation when they arrive in New Zealand. Many of the cases of COVID-19 that have arrived at our border, those people have come from India. And we're doing the right thing. They are going into managed isolation, and then we're making sure that they're free of the virus before they travel on and join our team of 5 million in New Zealand. But so that means we need to be careful and cautious about the way we lift restrictions on the border. And I think we just need to be honest and upfront with people that those border restrictions are going to remain in place for a long time. And even when we have a plan in place for the sequencing of temporary migrant workers being able to travel to New Zealand, when that plan is actually triggered will be highly dependent on our capacity in managed isolation. So we are certainly concerned about the welfare and the needs of those people. We understand that people want to get to New Zealand. But our border is protecting everybody who is here in New Zealand right now. We're doing exceptionally well in comparison to other countries. And so all of our decisions will make the top priority when we're making those decisions will be the health, safety, and well-being of the people who are here in New Zealand, keeping the virus out and keeping it contained at the border.
Sure, Minister, we get that. We have heard it multiple times, and we acknowledge your sentiments as well, that you are proactively thinking about all of them, and you are working on a guideline of sequencing how you can get them back as soon as you wish. But still, I have been categorically requested by our viewers, and I would remind you that they are not necessarily all from Indian origin, as you make it a point to say that the new cases that has arrived recently has come only from India, which we refute. There has been some cases from other countries as well.
Don't put words into my mouth, Sandeep. I never said only from India, but a large number of them have indeed come from India.
Coming back to what you were saying, Minister, I have been categorically requested by most of the temporary migrant workers who are stuck overseas that they acknowledge what you are doing behind the scene, but they still want to get some kind of time frame. They have waited for around 3 months. They have waited 3 months since border have closed. They have waited since 2 months we have come out of lockdown. They have waited for 45 days since Immigration New Zealand was given those exceptional powers. So they just need to understand that what's the kind of time frame you have got in mind.
Yeah, look, of course I understand the desire for a time frame. If I was in that situation, I would be looking for one too. But the honest truth, and I think it's really important that we're just really clear, upfront and honest with people about this, is that it's impossible to put a time frame on it right now because it is highly dependent on our capacity for managed isolation. And what we're seeing right now is an increasing number of New Zealand citizens and residents coming to New Zealand because we are safe, we are doing this very well, and we're attractive not only to temporary visa holders who want to get back here, but we're attractive to citizens and residents who have made a life elsewhere but want to come home to New Zealand. And of course, they have an absolute right to travel to their home country, and they are taking up the vast majority of those places in managed isolation. And even as Megan Woods works incredibly hard to increase the number of places that are available in managed isolation, that increasing number of New Zealanders takes those places up. So there's really complex issues at play here, Sandeep. I totally understand why people would like to see a time frame, but any time frame that I would give you tonight would just be a guess, and I don't think that's fair on people to do that.
Sure. Well, Minister, we have heard it many times, and I would say that most of the ministers in this government, they are coming back and they are saying the same line that most of the New Zealanders, they are coming back. Well, again, that's quite right. Nobody is refusing the rights of New Zealand citizens and residents to come back and live in this country. But we do take exception the way this government is trying to drive the public narrative and creating a us versus them mentality. The point I'm trying to make is that the temporary visa holders, temporary workers who were ordinarily resident in this country, they also have a right to come back. And the way government is trying to play up is putting one's right against another right. So is there not a way where you can manage this whole process in a better way, giving some entry to temporary visa holders depending on their compelling reasons as well, rather than just at the moment opening up borders for citizens and residents And based on the capacity that you have been telling time and again, 250 people odd that you can manage every day, probably we would have a wait time of around 450 years to get all those migrant workers back into the country. Do you think that's not possible?
Yeah, well, look, can I say Megan Woods has been doing an outstanding job, and we now have capacity for 6,000 people at any one time, and that's up from 3,200 when we were saying it was 250 people a day. And we're expecting that to increase to 7,000 in the coming week. There's 21 facilities now in Auckland, Rotorua, Christchurch, and Wellington. So we are really working extremely hard to increase that capacity to support more people to be able to cross our border. And as we increase that capacity, it gives us more options, more choices, and the ability to broaden the range of people who are able to travel into New Zealand. Of course, there are exceptions available. If people meet the criteria, whether it be for family reunification, so those partners of New Zealand citizens and residents and partners of temporary visa holders who are themselves ordinarily resident in New Zealand, they are able to travel to New Zealand now, and they don't even have to travel with their partner. They can travel on their own, and they can bring children as well.
Sure. Minister, I will come back.
And of course, people who have a significant economic a significant economic benefit to offer New Zealand have the ability to get an exception as well. So we're not completely closed off to temporary visa holders, and in fact, as of the 21st of June, in the period of time that we're talking about, 711 people have arrived on visitor visas, 744 have arrived on work visas, and 101 have arrived on student visas.
Well, thank you very much for that information, Minister. But I still believe that you have not answered my main question, that by saying that right now you are just allowing citizens and residents to come in, you might be creating a us versus them mentality. And coming back to the point that you are making about border exceptions, we will talk about that in detail a bit later, because what we have been hearing from a lot of our temporary migrant workers who are ordinarily resident in this country is that this whole process of border exception that should ideally be meant for new foreign travelers, new migrant workers who are wanting to work in this country and travel into this country, rather than people who have been ordinarily resident and living in this country for years, if not decades. So don't you think there is a problem with that whole process, the way this border exception is being designed and operated?
No, not at all. I think it's carefully strikes the balance between protecting the health and safety and welfare of everybody who is in New Zealand right now, with the needs to provide people with the ability to travel to New Zealand for genuine humanitarian reasons, for family reunification, and for economic purposes as well. These are challenging and complex issues. And look, nobody is saying that people don't have a right to be frustrated, to express their frustration, their desire to return to New Zealand. I completely understand. I really do. And as I say, people around the world have had their lives interrupted and disrupted by this. People continue to lose their lives all around the world. And it is inconvenient and it is difficult for many, many people. No one has lost sight of that. But for the government, we have to strike that balance, and within the parameters that are available to us, we think we've got the balance right of allowing people to be able to travel to New Zealand, but also making sure that we protect everybody who is here from a virus that appears to be raging uncontrollably around the world outside of New Zealand's borders.
Sure. Now, talking about border exceptions that you're talking about, and more about family reunion category. So, are you aware that ever since you made this announcement on June 12th, still probably around 80 to 90% people who were legitimate couple, they are still not able to travel to the country? Are you aware of that problem?
Aware of the fact that partners who are not ordinarily resident in New Zealand are not able to travel to New Zealand. So We were clear about that from the outset, that all of these exceptions for family reunification involved people who are ordinarily resident in New Zealand. So, yes,
And
I am aware
how do we
that,
define this period of ordinarily resident? Like your press release that came on June 12th, it did not put any time frame that how we are defining.
yeah.
I will just read
So
out what exactly was announced there and what you have announced in terms of relationship-based visa and how it is creating confusion between relationship visa and partnership-based visa. So technically, you announced that our border restrictions help us protect New Zealanders from COVID-19, so we are carefully taking steps that keep us safe while ensuring families can reunite. And then you go on and say that we are removing the requirement for partners and dependents of New Zealand citizens and residents who have a relationship-based visa or are ordinarily resident in New Zealand to travel together to be granted an entry exception. So this is a relationship-based visa. What exactly is that? Is there a legal term at all in immigration New Zealand laws?
no, that was just to make sure that we captured the appropriate variety of visas. But I know the group of people who will be particularly feeling this are those who have an arranged marriage with a spouse who has never been to New Zealand before. I appreciate how frustrating and difficult this is for people. But we were clear that this was an opportunity for people who had started to make a life here in New Zealand to be able to travel here. People who have never been to New Zealand before are not eligible for those exceptions. And
Well, the
I know
point is, I will explain. I get your point. The point is, sure, no, I understand. The point is that when you say relationship based visas, so a lot of people, as you have rightly pointed out, into Indian marriages and Indian partnerships who were caught up in the partnership visa issue last year. So, Immigration New Zealand went ahead and acknowledged that they were in a genuine and stable relationship, but they were not living together to be eligible to be considered for partnership based visas. So, based on their relationship, they were given journal visitor visa so that they can come and start their life over here. Now, what has happened? A lot of people, they have traveled over here, and unfortunately, they were caught up again on the wrong side of the border when COVID-19 hit upon us. So now, when they are going back to Immigration New Zealand and asking for exception, since they had a visitor visa that was based on relationship, but Immigration New Zealand is continuing to decline it and not accept it as a relationship-based visa. So how did that work out?
and that was the purpose of the policy. And this doesn't just apply to people who are in arranged marriages. You know, you've got examples of people who have gone to the UK or to Europe. They've met someone over there. They've come back to New Zealand. We've then gone into the border restrictions, and they would like their partner to be able to come and be with them here in New Zealand, but their partner has never been here before, and so they are caught by these rules in exactly the same way. But again, you can't help but feel for people. This is a difficult time for millions of people all around the world. But you know, again, we have had to strike a balance, and we have to be incredibly judicious about how many people we give the opportunity to seek an exemption, because you know we cannot overload the managed isolation system with more and more people, and we can't create the expectation that people will be able to travel to New Zealand because they can get an exception and they can get a visa, but then they can't get a place in managed isolation, and that could prevent them from coming here. So again, I think these are perfectly legitimate matters to be raising. I can understand why people want to know answers to this. I can understand why people would like us to be able to make a different decision. But right now, given the capacity that we have had to draw lines at certain points, and that is where we've drawn the line.
Right. Okay. Now, okay, we get that point. Now, the next thing is supposedly you are working in that direction and your intentions are right. You want to get all those temporary visa holders get into the country at some stage in distant future. So, what will happen to their visa status? As of now, they are still really, they are in a stage of suspended animation, if that's the right word to say that. So how does government is thinking to reinstate those visas if they are thinking on those lines? So what's your advice?
Yeah, look, I mean, this is an area that we are thinking about. I mean, first and foremost, of course, most temporary work visas are linked to a job. And so what we'll be particularly looking for is, do people still have a job in New Zealand? That where people are able to demonstrate that they have the job that qualified them for the visa in the first place.
So
Worst
basically, what you
case,
are meaning is that you will not automatically reinstate those visas. Rather, you will be treating those application as an altogether new work visa application. Is that what you're saying?
well, as I said, the worst case scenario is that people might have to apply for a new visa based on the continuation of that job. But that is, as I say, that's an area of policy that we are working through. But to give people a clear signal, what we will certainly be looking at is whether or not they still have the job that originally qualified them for that visa. And look, that's not just for labour market purposes. What we don't want to do is to have more people come into the country who don't have a job and are unable to sustain themselves, and therefore, are at risk of becoming vulnerable to exploitation, are in need of additional community support. Again, look, these are difficult messages for people to hear. I completely understand that, but there are complex issues at play here, and we need to make sure we get these policies right. So we're
Right.
we're looking very closely at all of these issues. And I do appreciate that is certainly an area of concern for people, that their visa will expire whilst they're offshore. And we'll certainly look to bring more clarity and certainty to that issue. But as I say, first and foremost, temporary work visas are always granted to people who are filling a role that cannot otherwise be filled by New Zealanders in the country. And
No,
so we'll
no,
be
that
certainly
point is
looking
absolutely clear, Minister, and
so
you are
we'll
quite
certainly
right.
be looking to make sure that those roles, that role still exists.
But the thing is that the way we fill those roles by giving them temporary migrant visa, temporary work visas, we also give them some sort of a surety of, say, 12 months, 18 months, and we give them a multiple entry visa as well so that they can travel overseas whenever it needs to and come back into the country. So, right now, if we are catching up in a very unsuspecting stage where they were traveling overseas just like normal, and we decide to close our border upon them for good, don't you think that's not a right thing to do?
Oh, look, it's a fair point, and that's exactly why we are considering what the policy options might be. If we weren't taking that into consideration, then we would simply say, if your visa expires, tough luck, and you'll just have to apply for another visa. That the very fact that we're considering what options might be available to us is a recognition of the fact that a lot of people have just been caught in a very difficult situation, and as you say, sort of have had the misfortune to be on the wrong side of the border at the time these restrictions came into place.
Sure. Now, since that's the worst case scenario, another hypothetical question that we have been continuously raised is for people who eventually could not find a job and therefore an eligibility to have their work visa reinstored. They still would have a life over here. They still would have their educational documents, marriage certificates, and whatnot. Which they have left them behind in a very unsuspecting fashion. So, would they get a dignified chance to come and collect it and live with dignity and respect? Or
Yes, yes. Again, that is a group of people who are on our minds, and we are certainly thinking about how we could facilitate exactly that to happen, for people to be able to come to New Zealand and arrange their affairs and settle up and head to their home country again. So, yes, that will be probably a little bit, the policy that would facilitate that to happen is probably a little bit further down the track. But you're absolutely right. That is something that we need to allow to happen, and we're working through how that could happen.
Sure. Well, that is definitely a bit assuring, I would say. Do not expect it. It's a very hard message. Now, coming back to another problem that our immigration system is facing is perennial delay in the processing of skilled migrant category. And again, probably we have got thousands of temporary migrant workers whose application is in a suspended animated state. So when exactly they can see some expedite action that can actually help them through?
Yeah, look, this is a really challenging area, right? And I think we've spoken before about how Immigration New Zealand needed to change their processing policies so that both the priority queue and the non-priority queue are able to move, and that is happening now. And I appreciate probably not with the amount of speed that a lot of people would want, but it is now happening. And so 52,000 residency visas were issued during the last planning range period. And
So, do
although
we
we
have
do,
numbers for this planning year, 2020?
I don't have exact numbers on me, but what I can say is that both the priority queue and the non-priority queue are now moving. And obviously, though, what was already a difficult situation was exacerbated by the lockdown and the fact that Immigration New Zealand lost processing capacity during that time. But they are now back up to speed and they are processing those visas. But the other thing that we're facing, of course, is that, yeah, we have for a very long time had a planning range for residency visas. And that means that by and large, the number of visas that we issue is set. And we have seen an enormous increase in the number of people applying for residency in New Zealand. We are a very popular place for people to travel to from overseas, and also, once people come here on a temporary visa, they have a very strong desire to stay. And so long as we continue to see that volume of applications increase, then we are probably likely to see the waiting time increase for the foreseeable future. Our waiting time still
So,
compares very.
have you set up any time frame expectation from Immigration New Zealand to process those applications for skilled migrant category?
Well, look, I've said to Immigration New Zealand that it would be ideal if we could see all of those applications being handled within a year. But I think we're a while off that happening. And as I say, right now we are actually seeing a significant increase in the volume of residency applications. And that means, that whilst that volume is coming in and we continue to process them within last year's planning range, then we're likely to see that tail grow. But it's not for want of Immigration New Zealand focusing their resources on it. And my expectations and my very close monitoring myself of how this is going. And as I've said before, this is a conversation that we have on a weekly basis with Immigration New Zealand, visa processing of all visa types. But I think we also have to acknowledge that they have been through a very challenging time. And of course, many of the Immigration New Zealand offices remain closed. The ones that are offshore, Beijing, Mumbai, Manila, they all remain closed. And of course, that has an impact on visa processing. The bulk, the residency visas, they are processed here in New Zealand. But of course, New Zealand offices are picking up some of the work that would have been done in offshore offices. So I think we've got to just acknowledge that the strain that Immigration New Zealand is under at the moment, how
Well,
hard they
surely,
are working
Minister.
to process those visas.
Yeah, surely, Minister, we do acknowledge the challenging time that COVID-19 has brought upon us. But the thing is that the crisis or the delay that temporary migrant workers have been experiencing in their engagement with Immigration New Zealand has not been creation of COVID-19. It has actually been very, very slow and archaic, even in last 2 or 3 years. So a lot of temporary migrants, probably tens of thousands, who are onshore and who have put up their application for skilled migrant category, they are now being affected by the impact of job losses and redundancies caused by COVID-19. And Immigration New Zealand, as of now, is trying to put the responsibility back on them to find a job to remain eligible for their permanent residency. So, do you think it's a fair expectation to be put upon those temporary migrant workers who have done
Well,
everything right in last 2 or 3 years to be in that queue and wait for the outcome?
well, of course, yeah, we've the concept that residency comes with securing a long-term placement in usually a moderately to highly skilled role is one which has been around for a very long time. Again, this is a challenging area of policy for the government. There's certainly a balance to be struck here. But this question has been raised with me, and I'm seeking advice on how we might approach this. But the pathway has always been you either get residency from offshore because you're a highly skilled individual who's moving into a highly paid role, and you have skills and experience that are simply not available in New Zealand, or you come here as a temporary worker, you get into long-term employment, you work your way up, and you demonstrate that you are needed in New Zealand on a long-term basis, and as you say, you pay your dues along the way. Now, look, again, this is another one of those examples of where this has interrupted and disrupted people's lives. A challenging situation for people to face, and a challenging situation for government as well to get the balance right. But again, this is another area where we are considering what our policy options might be.
And when can we expect some favorable decisions from your government? Because that is the most pressing question that we have been relayed by our members of audiences.
Yeah, I understand. Look, there are some matters which I think you can expect to see decisions within the next few weeks. I certainly know there are questions about things like the stand down period. There are questions around what will happen on the 25th of September when all of those visas that were extended under the pandemic management notice. What are we going to do around those things? Those are the sorts of things that people can expect decisions on in the short term. And then some of the other things that we've been talking about will be more medium-term matters, where I think you'll hear back from us later on in the year.
Sure. After elections, is that what you're saying?
Oh, some things before, some things after. There is an extraordinary amount of work being done by the public sector at the moment. I think that the proactive release of documents last Friday just shows you how hard everybody is working to get the advice that ministers need to be able to make these very difficult decisions.
Well, sure.
We've got to sequence these things. We've got to look at what are the things that need an immediate answer, what are the things which, although frustrating, might be able to be answered a little bit further down the track. And
Sure.
I absolutely appreciate everybody's desire for information, and we're working really hard to answer those questions.
Sure. Now, as I said, nobody is doubting that people they are working hard, but the only question and frustration is that there are no answers out of. There is no decisions coming out. And,
well, there have been a lot of actually. I'm going to challenge
that we have been hearing a lot is that minister has been given with exceptional power under Immigration COVID-19 Response Immigration Act, but still we haven't seen any action for last 45 days. So, what exactly you are waiting for?
Well, I'm going to challenge the idea that there have been no decisions. There was the immediate decision to extend visas through to the 25th of September.
Well, that was before the Immigration Amendment Act was passed. So that was the question.
There was the decision to include migrant workers in the eligibility for the wage subsidy. There was the decision to extend welfare support to temporary migrant workers who are in New Zealand. There were decisions around RSE workers. There were decisions to allow students working in the health sector and in supermarkets to be able to vary their conditions. So there's been a lot of decisions made to support New Zealand's response, to help the immigration system to support the response to COVID-19 and to address welfare issues for migrants. Now, on the specific powers that have been provided for under the Act, one of the main messages we got whilst the bill was going through the House is that these are significant powers, and they need to be used judiciously and wisely by the government and me as minister. And I have been taking advice. I'm very close to making some decisions, and where I have to go to cabinet or I have to get support from my government colleagues. I'm in the process of doing that. So you can expect to see some decisions making use of those additional powers very, very soon. But again, it's got to be done in a careful, measured, balanced and judicious fashion.
Sure, we get that. Now, Minister, another complaint, I would say, or request that we have received from our large number of audiences is that the manner in which Immigration New Zealand exercises their power in a very discretionary manner. So, talking about exceptions for partners and getting them into the country. On one hand, there are partners who applied for a partnership-based visa and that were languishing in the long queues, waiting around 6 to 9 months for processing. It took about that much of time for Immigration New Zealand to establish that the couple were in a genuine, stable, living together relationship. But on the other hand, where we have seen, say, in the cases of the members of the crew of Avatar film, they were handed in partnership-based visa within a matter of days. So why this discrepancy, or why this special discretion for some and unreasonable exercise of power for others?
Well, it's because people in those cases were applying under different categories, and so
So we have a different category for partnership-based visa as well, as of now?
The bulk of people who have been applying for, whether it be for partnership or for humanitarian reasons or other exceptions, only 20% of those are being accepted, and that's because a large number of people are making applications that clearly fall outside of the criteria. The case of the Avatar crew, they applied through an economic exception criteria that we have in place. They were able to demonstrate that bringing that crew to New Zealand would result in about 1,000 jobs for New Zealanders being created. And so that's why they were granted that exception under that category. People who are able to demonstrate that they meet the family reunification criteria or they meet the humanitarian criteria, those exceptions are generally being processed in about 2 or 3 days. Where I can appreciate that there is frustration, again, is that a large number of people making those applications clearly fall outside of the criteria and therefore are being turned down. Hey, Sandeep, I have just noticed that we've gone quite a bit over the time that we agreed for this interview, and I'm actually speaking with a range of Indian media this afternoon, so I do need to
I completely understand, Minister. And before I let you go, one final question, and that is based on what you have just now touched, that a lot of our audiences, they have said that Minister is not giving us Indian Weekend a lot of time, actually. He's speaking to everyone else. It took around, I think, 6 to 8 months to get you back to our studio. So can we expect you more frequently from moving forward from here? Once in a month, maybe?
I love my conversations with you, Sandeep. And I can assure you, you get as much love as any of the other Indian news outlets. So, very keen.
That's a commitment for once in a month, again, seeing you at our studio?
Well, of course, we're heading into the election period soon, and maybe I'll speak to you soon, not so much as the minister, but as the Labour Party spokesperson for immigration. And that'll be an interesting time for us to talk about what the Labour Party's policies will be going into the election and what we might do differently depending on what form of government we have after the election.
Sure, great. Thank you very much, Minister. We do acknowledge your time today and the time that you have spent a little bit more than what we have agreed for. You definitely shared with us some good news, I would say, that some big decisions are coming in the matter of weeks, as you have promised. And you have also hinted that there might be some bad news as well, which we will continue to debate and raise with you and your office again. But thanks for joining us for today.
Thanks, Sandeep. Take care.
Thank you.